We have been waiting such a long time for Wonder Woman 1984, but it's finally here as it just officially released on both HBO Max and in theaters. But don't worry, guys, we are not talking about spoilers here. This is the full-on non-spoiler review, so if you haven't seen the movie yet, you're in luck because no spoilers here. But this movie was crazy. This movie really was crazy. And of course, we will do a full in-depth spoiler review and breakdown. That's coming out tomorrow, so definitely stay tuned for that. But for now, let's jump right into this by talking about the expectations for this film, because this is a sequel, and the first movie was so good. It was one of, if not the best movie in the DCEU. So it's going to be hard to top that, and that's one of the things a lot of people were wondering, like, is this going to be as good as the first film? Is it going to be better, or is it just going to be sucky in comparison? And I have to say, for me, it's definitely hard to tell, and it's definitely a close call. But I do think the first movie just has a slight edge, and it is just a little bit better. But that being said, that movie is such a good movie, and this movie is a really good movie as well. It's just that first movie has a bit of a slight edge, and the weird thing is that this movie is so different from the first movie, because in the first one, we got to see the full-on Amazon warrior princess version of Wonder Woman, where she was battling everybody, she had her sword and shield and everything. But in this movie, we get to see the opposite version of her. We get to see the more peace-loving version of Wonder Woman, where she just wants to defend everyone. That's why she only uses her lasso. Plus, it takes place in the 80s, so of course it's all colorful and everything, where the first one was more dark and gritty. And I like both of those. And it's really cool because Wonder Woman has always been a character that has been able to balance out these two. So I like that you're able to kind of pick and choose which version of Wonder Woman you like more, whether you like the full-on warrior version or the more peace-loving version. And I honestly like both, but like I said, slight edge to the first one. And the theme of this new movie is basically be careful what you wish for. And we see that done in so many different movies all the time. But the way it's done in this movie is very different. I mean, it's not that different, but it has its own little twists and turns here. And this main plot is really tied to each individual character, and you see it affect each character in their story and development throughout this movie. And that's what I really like seeing, because sometimes you have all these main characters, but then they're off doing all these different things, and some of them don't even have anything to do with the main plot. But here, they're all tied to the main plot, and they all have their own things going on, and by the end of the movie, you do get to see them come together, and they have to face the consequences. And you know, you can wish for anything you want, but there is going to be a cost for that, and you don't just get everything for free. And we especially see that affect Diana, because of course this is her movie, so of course she is in the spotlight, and we see that even though this is, I think, like 40 years later after the first movie, she still thinks about Steve every single day. And that's why it's so crazy for her when he comes back, because she's been missing him. And you know, you'd think she'd be super popular and everything, and that was kind of Barbara Minerva's first impression of her. But she doesn't really do anything. She doesn't really have a life, because Steve was her life. And I know that's kind of cliche to say, but it's true. And I really loved seeing that. I loved seeing that dynamic between Steve and Diana in this movie again. And speaking of Steve, he's back, and that was a big thing that people were worried about with this movie. When it was announced that he was coming back, we were like, oh, is that going to cheapen his sacrifice that we saw in the first movie? And I have to say, it doesn't. I mean, it depends on how you look at it, because it definitely wasn't necessary to bring him back here. But the way they explain how he came back, it tied into the main plot, and there was a reason for it to happen. And plus, it's just so cool to see Chris Pine back. I never really cared for the character before that movie, but seeing him in that role and seeing the connection and the relationship between those two in both of these movies was really cool, especially in this movie, because the first movie they didn't really have any time to actually be a couple. In this movie, they're a full-on couple, and even though relationship is kind of on the back burner in this movie because you've got everything else going on, it was definitely really, really cool to see the dynamic between the two characters. And like I said, they did explain how he came back and why he came back, but then again, it wasn't really necessary for him to come back. But now on to another character that people were kind of concerned about seeing in this movie, and that is, of course, the Cheetah, because obviously it was cool to see her in this movie, and we were all excited to see her come in here and be in live action because she is Wonder Woman's arch enemy and she is the big villain of Wonder Woman. But we were interested to see how they would pull this off, and I have to say, in my personal opinion, I was definitely concerned at first when they announced that Kristen Wiig was going to play the role, because I'm used to seeing her on Saturday Night Live and being full-on comedy Kristen Wiig. So I was concerned, like, how is she going to do this serious villainous role with Cheetah? And I was definitely concerned about how it was going to turn out. But I have to say, she did an amazing job. I was really impressed with her in this movie. And at the beginning of the film, I did get that feeling like, oh no, it's just SNL Kristen Wiig. But then it made sense because that was the shy, unpopular version of Barbara Minerva. But then we saw her go through this transformation throughout the film to her eventually becoming the Cheetah. And I loved how there were these little changes within every single scene as you saw this evolution within Kristen Wiig's performance, and I love those little details that you could just see, little hints of her going farther and farther off the edge to becoming a full-on villain, and that was really cool to see. Now, the one thing about her character was the final battle when she actually was Cheetah. You know, her actual design as Cheetah, it wasn't that bad. I actually kind of liked it overall. You know, the face looked like Kristen Wiig as a Cheetah person, so that was cool to see. But the actual final battle itself between Wonder Woman and Cheetah was a little lacking because, you know, the CGI on Cheetah, like I said, it didn't look bad when she was just standing still and like in a pose or something, but when they were in close-up shots for moving around and fighting Diana, the CGI didn't look great. It really didn't look that good. And you know, the whole battle was kind of like a Cirque du Soleil kind of performance. Like, you just saw those two doing acrobatic moves back and forth. And it was really cool to see, but it's definitely not the type of action that you would expect to see in a superhero Wonder Woman movie like this, especially with Cheetah being Wonder Woman's main villain, and just that battle being so, you know, it seemed very choreographed, and also it was very short. Which was kind of sad to see, which also Cheetah didn't really have that big of a role in the movie anyway at all, even outside of that action scene, because she was not the main villain of the movie. It was actually Maxwell Lord, who of course was played by Pedro Pascal, and this character was so good in this movie. Pedro Pascal just stole the show in this movie, and nobody was expecting it because, you know, most of us were expecting to seeing him, we're used to seeing him as the Mandalorian, but obviously he has the helmet on and everything, so you don't really see his true potential. You don't see what he can really bring to the role and what he can really bring to an acting role. But you really see it in this film with all the emotional scenes that he has, and you know, he was just such a cool character, and such a character, like I said, that nobody was expecting to be this good, because in the comics, for the most part, Maxwell Lord, you know, he's just a businessman that, you know, is a villain, but he doesn't really do anything cool. But in this movie, they gave him a backstory with abuse in his childhood, and he has a son, and I loved how throughout this whole film, you really had sympathy for this character, and that's kind of like what you saw with Thanos, is that you have these characters where you sympathize for them because their goal, like, it makes sense because they see themselves as the hero. They're just going about doing it the wrong way. But you really see that here with this character because his whole life he's been a loser, and he just doesn't want to be a loser anymore. He wants to prove himself, and he wants to be accepted. And this character's arc by the end of the film is just so beautiful because he's not a full-on villain. Like I said, he's just doing things the wrong way. And of course, he does tie to the main plot of the movie, and he was really, really cool to see. And that's all I'm going to talk about for now because, of course, we will talk about this more in the spoiler review coming tomorrow. But because Maxwell Lord was the main villain of the movie, you really didn't get that much action because even though he did have powers, he didn't actually fight Diana. And then, like I said, with the Cheetah final battle, that really didn't last too long, and it really wasn't that great of a battle. But it did still look really cool, and I love seeing that. So that was one of the big problems with the movie, was just the major lack of action, which is weird to see in now more modern superhero movies. But the action that we did get in this movie was really, really good and really awesome to see. Obviously, from the title of the movie, you know that this movie takes place in the 80s, in 1984, and this was just really cool to see. This was one of the things that, like I said, made it so different from the first movie, was just all the color and just the bright 80s vibes going on here, and I just love that. I love the 80s, even though I wasn't around in the 80s. I just love everything from the 80s. I love the colors. I love seeing the clothes in this movie. I love 80s music, which was one thing. Another thing that was a little lacking in this movie was, since it takes place in the 80s, it would have been awesome to see some 80s music because I love 80s songs and 80s music. So that would have been awesome to see, but at the same time, we did have that fantastic score from Hans Zimmerman, who just made this so good. I love the music, and it's not really something you think about when you're watching it and when you're watching the movie, but if you didn't have that score in the background, there would just be something lacking, and it really adds something to the movie and adds much more emotion to the scene and whatever is going on in the moment. So I really love the score, and I really love the 80s time period that we had going on here. So overall, guys, this was a very, very entertaining DC movie that is really perfect for the times that we're living in right now. And like I said, while it isn't quite as good as the first movie, it definitely comes close, and I definitely love this movie, and we have a lot to talk about in the spoiler review, so definitely stay tuned for that. But for now, guys, let me know down in the comments below all your non-spoiler thoughts on this movie. What did you think about it? Did you enjoy it? Did you not enjoy it? Did you think it was better than the first movie? Let me know. So anyways, guys, definitely stay tuned for the spoiler review tomorrow. And thanks so much for watching. Please drop a like if you enjoyed this video and hit the subscribe button so I can keep you up to date on everything that goes on in the DC life.